Okay, so welcome everyone tonight. We are in the book of Kings 1, the very last chapter, which, as you know, is chapter 22. We've been on it for quite a while, but it's a very intense chapter, very intense and very interwoven chapter. So it's justified to spend the time on it. And we happen to. So I'd like to start from verse 34. That's where I'd like to start from. I am not going to tell you that we are, I mean, we covered this, but I want to backtrack a little bit. So just as a lead-in, remember that this is the battle of Ramoth Gilead is going on, and and the king of Aram had commanded his troops to only shoot at the king of Israel, and no one else. Shoot your arrows at the king of Israel. And because Ahab went with his brother-in-law Jehoshaphat into battle, and Jehoshaphat was dressed as in his royal garments, and Ahab disguised himself, hoping to elude recognition. It only somewhat worked. At first the archers thought that they were shooting at Ahab, when in fact, they were aiming at Ahab, when in fact they were aiming at Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat, let out a yell, and they recognized that it wasn't Ahab's voice. And then someone just released an arrow without any intent, and it happened to hit Ahab. So let's go to and that's where we're holding. We said it last week, but we rushed it a little, so let's go back. Ve'ish moshach bikeshes lesumai vayaka es melech Yisrael ben hadvokim, and the Ubein Hashirion, and there was a man who drew his bow without intent. Someone in the army of Aram, drew his bow without intent, and he hit Ahab between the joints of his armor. And the arrow got him between the joints of his armor. The king said to his to the charioteer, the one driving his chariot, turn your hand, say Eini mina machneki hachalesi, and take me out of the battle encampment because I have turned ill. Vatale hamilchama bayom hahu, and the war intensified that day. Hamelech hoya me'omod b'merkava noichach Aram v'meis, and King Ahab was propped up in his chariot against Aram, but he died. Be'erev, in the evening. Vayomas be'erev, he died in the evening. Vayotzek dam hamerkava el cheik harechev, and the dam hamak, excuse me. Vayotzek dam hamak el cheik harechev, and the blood of the wound poured out into the bosom of the chariot, meaning the bottom part was collected on the bottom. He bled to death. So they propped him up in the chariot in order to, make it look like he's still in the fight. But the reality was his life was ebbing away. Vayavor harina b'machane, and there was an outcry an outcry passed through the camp at sunset, announcing, Ishal Irov, Ishal Arzo, Each person to his city, each person to his land. Means everyone return to your city, return to your land. In other words, with troops withdraw. There's not so as the prophet had Michayu had told Ahab, that this was going to be a battle that he wasn't going to win. This was going to be a battle which God was not on his side, and indeed, he bled to death in that battle. Vayomos Hamelech Vayovoy Shomron, and the king passed away, and they came to Shomron. Vayikru as Hamelech b'Shomron, and they had buried the king in Shomron. Shomron is Samaria.
Mm.
You hear Judea, Samaria?
Yeah.
Well, Judea is the hills of the tribe of Judah, and Samaria is where the tribe of Joseph was. Don't let anyone ever tell you that wasn't our land, and that isn't our land. That was this was so King Ahab was buried in Shomron. Now watch what happens. Vayishtoif es harechev al berechas Shomron, and they washed his chariot because it was bloody on the pool of Shomron. Vayilaku haklovim es damai, and the dogs lapped up his blood. Vahazoinos rochatzu kidvar Hashem asher dibra, and the prostitutes washed themselves in it as the word of God had spoken. Now, what happened here? Now, I wanted to spend a little time on this verse. If you'll take a look, you'll see that. Let us take a look. I hear a conversation in the background. If someone has some sort of conversation going on in the background, I ask you if you could please mute your mic. You can always turn it back on if you want to ask a question. I do hear a small conversation in the background. So, what did Eliyahu Hanavi tell Ahab at the time when he had after Navos was murdered? If you'll take a look in the last chapter, chapter 21, verse verse 19.
Yeah, 19.
Right. It says, I'm just going to read an English translation. When you speak to him saying, "Thus says God, will you murder and also inherit?" Then shall you speak to him further and saying, "Thus says God, in the place where the dogs licked up the blood of Navos, the dogs will lick up your blood as well."
Mm.
So this is the fulfillment of that prophecy. That the blood they say this happened in the vineyard of Navos, which that they washed the chariot out in that vineyard area, and when they washed it out, maybe they chose it particularly because probably it's blood is good fertilizer for the vines, for the grapes, and when they washed it out, they what's it called? It was washed out in the spot where the dogs licked up Navos's blood. There too, Ahab's blood was licked up. measure for measure. Mida keneged mida. In English, we say what comes around goes around. So this was measure for measure. Now, what do the prostitutes have to do with it? So our sages say that, one moment, that this was, there's some sages who say this was literal, that they took a bath in it. You have to understand that in those days, women had liked to have contact with the flesh or whatever of strong men. This was the mindset. The gladiators in Rome, the filings of the gladiators, when they would file their skin, take off the callous skin. The calluses were used for lotions by the women to beautify themselves. Seriously.
Yeah.
In Native America, when they captured a warrior, what's it called? They tie him up, and the women of the tribe would want a piece of his strength, and they would, until they decided to roast him. Each night, another woman slept. This is the way it was. Each night, another woman in the tribe wanted a child with his strength, would sleep with him. Interestingly, the Philistines did the same with Samson, with Shimshon, when he was locked up. That some say Goliath came from that union. This was the thinking. And then after they would roast the Native America, they would roast the warrior, and the women who would be the first to take of his flesh, that they ate.
Cannibals?
There were parts of Native America that were that way. Not all of Native America, but there were some tribes. Listen, different tribes had different ways. It wasn't one size fits all. There were some tribes that were that way. So that would explain it on a literal level. That these women, they wanted to bathe in the king's blood. They felt it was bring them vitality. Something magical about the king's blood. But our other sages, Rashi included, have a different view of what happened over here. What happened is that that Ahab was sexually frigid. So his wife Izebel had images of harlots on his chariot to warm him up. This is what Rashi says, that she carved images of harlots on his chariots to keep him to arouse his passions, hoping to arouse his passions. So it's those engraved images of harlots that were washed by the blood.
Yeah, well, it comes from Sanhedrin 39b, probably.
Okay.
There was a rabbi who said, tone down the text by rendering, they washed the harlots, which was washed with indecent pictures of women, which was painted in chariots. So that must be, I don't know if Rashi might have taken it from.
Rashi was the master of Talmud. The only way we understand Talmud today is because of Rashi.
Right, but I'm just saying it was written that way before Rashi did it.
Right. No, yeah. Well, you have to know something about Rashi. He very rarely ever says anything, of his own. He views himself as a very clear, transparent conduit of the tradition.
Right.
Very skillful conduit of the tradition. And in that capacity, he also happens to be its greatest communicator in many ways, because he said many things in very few words. He had that unique ability. And when Rashi says something of his own, it comes with a lot of reluctance. And he tells you, this is the way it seems in my heart. He tells you that this is that this is the way it seems in his heart. He doesn't leave you guessing when he says something that's his own. Like the one place he says it that I know of is in the case of the ephod, the backward apron of the high priest, from which the breastplate was hung and attached on the bottom as well. That backwards apron called the ephod. Rashi says he hasn't seen anything that in our tradition that clearly describes it, but he had a hunch. He saw the French noblewomen that they would ride their horses with a cape that was in that form, and somehow he felt God was telling him that this was the shape of the ephod. Beruach HaKodesh, with the movement of the Holy Spirit, with God's divine inspiration, he felt that he was being shown that this is the ephod, to restore it for our tradition. Everything else he didn't have to do that for the choshen, for the breastplate. He knew he had exact traditions on. For the mitznefes, the headpiece, he had exact traditions on. The tzitz, the forehead plate, he had exact traditions on. The avnei shoham, he had the shoulder stones, he had exact traditions on. The only thing he didn't have an exact tradition on was the ephod, and with that he said, this is what I saw, this is what it seems to me. I think God was communicating to me that this is what it is. So we see that Rashi, as a whole, doesn't make up anything. It does. How do I say? He's not into sharing with you his what's called his own Torah novella, his own unique Torah ideas. What he's trying to do is he's functioning as as clear possible conduit for the tradition, for the oral tradition. So yeah, I mean, we only know Talmud because of Rashi on the Talmud, or a few cases, in a few tractates, his grandson, the Rashbam, who continued his grandfather's work. But he told everyone that I will continue my grandfather's work. I'll say what he would have said, but don't expect his brevity from me. I don't have his gift of brevity. So the Rashbam is a lot longer. But at least we know what Rashi would have said, at least conceptually. So yeah, it's not at all a surprise to me that Rashi is quoting the Talmud over here. Okay, so let's continue on. Okay. And now this is the end of the story of Achav. The Yeser Divrei Achav, and the rest of the story of Achav. B'chol asher osa, and everything he did, uveis hashen asher bona, and the ivory palace that he built, b'chol ha'orim, and all the city asher bona, all the cities that he built, Haloheim kisuvim al sefer divrei hayomim l'malchei Yisrael, aren't they written up in the chronicles of the kings of Israel? Vayishkav Achav im avoisav, and Achav was laid to rest with his fathers. Vayimloich Achazyahu v'noi Sachtov, and his son Achazyahu ruled in his stead. Now, I do want to say, I know I've said it a few times, but just as a quick reminder, what it means that someone lain with his fathers, on the straightforward, simple level, it means that they had family plots and they buried family together. So laying with his father was a way of was a euphemistic way of saying someone's buried in his family plot. So verse 41. Jehoshaphat ben Asa Molach al Yehuda, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Asa, ruled over Judah. Bishnas Arba Achav Melech Yisrael. He became king in the 4th year of while Achav was king of Israel. The 4th year of Achav's reign, Jehoshaphat became king of Judah. So now we're moving towards the kingdom of Judah a little bit. We spoke quite a bit about the kingdom of Israel. Now we're moving over a little bit to talk about the kingdom of Judah. The story flips back and forth alternates between the kings of Judah, the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah, the kings of Israel. Sometimes it spends an extended period of time on one king. Sometimes it just spends a little bit on the king. You just have to follow the weave of the text. Now, but notice how they counted years back then. They counted it by the years of the reign. And when is the beginning of the year of a reign, when it isn't, that's a whole nother story. I think there's more than one way of looking at it. V'Yehoshaphat ben shloishim v'chamesh shana b'molchoi. And Jehoshaphat was 35 years old when he was crowned as king. And he ruled in Jerusalem for 25 years. 25-year reign. So 35 plus 25 equals
60.
So probably, I would presume, based on this, he lived about 60 years. B'shem imo Azuva bas Shilchi. The name of his mother is Azuva bas Shilchi, which to me is an interesting name. I don't know why, how someone got this very, very descriptive name. And literally, it means the abandoned one, the daughter of the one who sent me. I don't know how she got such. We got the 10-minute mark, everyone. Just letting you know. Okay. All right. So, anyways, but that is that is her name. So, anyways, Vayelech b'chol derech asa oviv v'loisar miyaminoi imenu, and he went the way of his father Achav. He didn't turn away from it. Asa was a good king. He was a king who followed God's ways. He rejected idolatry. So when it says he went in the ways of his father Asa, it means that he was faithful to God. Lo sarmi menu, he didn't veer away from it. Lasois hayosher b'nei Hashem, and he doing what is right in God's eyes. Ach bomois loisaru, but he did not remove the high places. The nation was still offering sacrifices and incense, burnt offerings upon the high places. So, or incense on the high
Wait,
places.
to idols? Do they
Yeah, no. Oh, this is an interesting question. So notice it does not say to idols, it just
Yeah,
says high places. So the understanding is that once Yerushalayim became the center of our worship, no one is allowed to offer sacrifices any longer on the high places, on personal, what we mean by high places are personal altars. It was in your backyard, you could have an altar. That was permitted until the Holy Temple was built. Once the Holy Temple was built, you cannot offer a sacrifice on your personal altar anymore. You had to bring it to the Holy Temple.
Oh, okay.
So this was not as severe as what was going on in the Northern Kingdom, because these were not sacrifices to idols. These were sacrifices to God. But they, at the same time, they were, they were forbidden. It's forbidden to sacrifice on a private altar. Today, a Noahide is still allowed to sacrifice on a private altar, but a Jew is not allowed to. So, if a Noahide wants to build an altar in his backyard or her backyard, that's fine. So then they have to find a rabbi who knows how to tell them how to do the sacrifices. So anyways, so getting back to this, the Chassam Sofer asked an interesting question. Jehoshaphat was such a righteous king. Why did he allow these altars to continue? Why didn't he put an end to it? So the Chassam Sofer answers that he didn't put an end to it because he had a deep concern that if he didn't allow it, in a time when idolatry was rampant and the natural religious tendency was that people wanted worship to be close at home and easy, and going to Jerusalem was not always easy. For some people, it was a long trip. If he wouldn't have allowed it, he was afraid that they would descend into idolatry. So he felt although he could not openly sanction it because it was forbidden by the Torah, but he overlooked it because he felt it was preventing idolatry from catching hold in his kingdom, which he felt was obviously the worst of the two. Vayishalem Yehoshaphat im Melech Yisrael, and Yehoshaphat, as we see, had made a peace treaty with the king of Israel, with Ahab. There's mixed opinions as whether this was a good thing or not. I mean, generally say making peace is good, but this was but Ahab was a real idol worshiper, and this wasn't a benign thing. V'yeser divrei Yehoshaphat ugvurasa she'asa, and the rest of the chronicles of Yehoshaphat and the valorous things he did, Asher Nilcham, and the wars that he waged, Halohem Kesuvim, Al Sefer Divrei Yomim L'Malchei Yehuda, aren't they written up in the chronicles of the kings of Judah? The Yeser Kodesh and Nishar B'mei Asa Aviv Biyar Min Haaretz, and the remaining sacred prostitutes that were in the land at the time that his father Asa did not manage to get rid of, Yehoshaphat got rid of the remaining sacred prostitutes. That was prostitutes for idolatrous reasons, for fertility rites and things of that sort. Ve'umelech ein be'edai nitzav melech, and there was no king in in the country of Edom because it was controlled by Judah, but they had a governor that ruled them. Jehoshaphat asa oniyos tarshish leches ofira lezahav leholach ginishra oniyos be'etzion gover. And Jehoshaphat, he made ships to go to Ophir, which I think is in Africa, to get gold. And this was a joint venture with Achazyahu, the son of Ahab, and God didn't like it, so the ships broke before they even embarked.
Huh?
Yep. Oz Omar Achazyahu ben Ahab el Yehoshaphat Yelchu Avodaim Avodech Ba'onios. And then Achazyahu said, oh, wanted to continue the venture. He said, okay, our ship's broke, let's fix it, and let my servants and your servants go back on the ships. The lo ova Yehoshaphat, but Yehoshaphat learned his lesson. He didn't he didn't want to join the venture. He didn't want to partner with Achazyahu on the venture. Vayishkav Yehoshaphat imavoisav, and Yehoshaphat was laid to rest with his fathers. Vayikover imavoisav, and he was buried with his fathers. Be'ir David, in Aviv, in the city of David, his father. Vayimloch Yehoram b'nai tachtav, and his son Yehoram ruled in his stead. Okay, so this is like kind of the end of a section, and we got maybe a minute and a half left. So I just wanted to share that that here it doesn't only say he was buried with his fathers, but that but it emphasized that he was buried with his fathers in the city of David. In other words, he was buried as a king, with kingly regality, as a king, where the kings are buried. Anyways, so thank you for joining tonight. It was a great class.
Thank you for teaching us.
My pleasure. It's always my pleasure. Okay. Shavua Tov Varach.
Shavua Tov.
Okay. Shalom, shalom.
Thank you.
You're welcome.